Okay, this week we're going to focus on Matt Rasmussen's Black Aperture. Um, I always like to teach this collection for a number of reasons. One, its tone, as well as how it addresses themes. So there is an undoubtedly dark tone that runs the breadth of this collection. I think he handles it, the poet handles it in a evocative sort of way, and it's very effective in the way he handles these dark themes and this dark tone of sort of a family in the aftermath of mourning this absence of his brother, right? So let's get into it. Let's look at some of the reoccurring themes within this collection, some of the language, how Rasmussen is able to allow the narrator of the poetry to grapple with the vacuous space that exists within his brother's absence. Whether it's with poetry, the actual collection of poetry, with regard to the title, or whether it's within the actual collection of each title of the poem, one always has to take a look, a close look even, at the title and what is the reasoning behind the title of this collection, Black Aperture. For sure, without any doubt, Rasmussen would have given the name Black Aperture to this collection for a very deliberate reason. We might look at how a greater meaning is derived from the collection title. Within Black Aperture, specifically how light passes through it or anything else. It's a part of a camera, the mechanism of a camera, right? That allows light to come in, its exposure and its ability to render an image uh, must all be considered here with regard to the title Black Aperture. Also, the title is reminiscent of the conflict that exists between light and dark, a concept that might be categorized as binary oppositions, as light will always oppose darkness. Just in accessing the poems I wanted to focus on in these upcoming days, namely the poem Monet as a Verb, the three poems that are interesting within the collection titled After Suicide, and then of course Reverse Suicide, which is we're going to look at tomorrow, and then Trajectory and Chekhov's Gun. Those seven poems, we see language that the poet is intentionally embedding in order to reflect the title of the collections. Words such as light occurs 5 times, black 3, and through 4 times. The repetition of these words in just 7 poems, a very short space really, shows Rasmussen is building reoccurring themes through the language. Perhaps the light and the dark that exist is a metaphoric rendering of our emotions or his slash the narrator's psychological state. So it's important that we inspect whether it's the collection's title or specifically each poem's title. We drill down on the meaning of the actual title. As I said before, it would have been highly intentional on Rasmussen's part to give the title this infused meaning through the titles within the collection. As you can see here within what the actual definition of an aperture is in photography, aperture refers to the opening of a lens's diaphragm through which light passes. In this case, you can think of light as life, the passing of the light within the collection, his brother's absence through his suicide. Um, that always is able to bring some level of meaning to the collection and to each poem. Another interesting element that was highly intentional on Rasmussen's part is the structuring elements within the poetry itself. We see here that he is able to access the syllabic form. And by that, we mean he's able to actually use each couplet within the poetry and render it with by counting the syllables. If you can see here, we have a Dylan Thomas, um, a famous Welsh poet, one of his poems, "In My Craft or Sullen Art," and he is able to as well use the structuring element of syllables, syllabic form, syllabic verse, it's sometimes called. We'll just go ahead and read it. In my craft or sullen art, exercised in the still night. So if we start with those first 2 lines, he's not using a couplet, he's using a large stanza with very short syllabic form. In my craft or sullen art. So we get 6 or 7, it looks like there's 7 syllables within that. If we look over to Rasmussen's poem, After Suicide, this is an excerpt from it. A whole is nothing. So 5 syllables. But what remains around it? 7 syllables. My brother stood. 4 syllables. It's almost as if it's haiku-esque, isn't it? We get 5, 7, 4, close enough. 5, 7, 5. How? And the question is, and it begs this, is why? What is the point that throughout the whole collection, Rasmussen is intentionally rendering his poetry, both mostly within couplets. There are a few poems within it, namely Chekhov's Gun, that divert away from that structuring element. But why would he care about counting the syllables? And he does if you go through the collection, and this is something you can even write about within your short essays, even your final essay, is a syllabic form as a structuring element within Rasmussen's black aperture, right? Would be something to the effect of your thesis statement. It could be for a number of reasons. And I would ask you to go out on a sort of a limb to sort of discover why, and to figure and to compare it and contrast it like I did here with Dylan Thomas's structuring through syllabic form. Maybe it's to indicate imbalance as we shift each set of syllables in some sort of turbulent act to sort of reflect upon the themes of the actual collection, the imbalance of not having his brother around anymore due to his suicide, the imbalance that his brother's absence creates within the family dynamics, right? The family nucleus. So as I show here in the title of this slide, there's approximately 5, 6, 7, 8 syllables per line within most of the poetry. There's a few outliers. Okay, let's go ahead and take a look at the three poems that are titled the same, After Suicide. I'm going to go ahead and read it, and then we're going to discover some of the structuring as well as poetic elements that Rasmussen included. After Suicide. Now, as I read this, I want you to go ahead and do the same thing, is to sort of respect the white space. This is not a perfect rendering copy. It doesn't have perfect fidelity to what's actually in the book, and that's because of some of the shortcomings of PowerPoint, but I try to do it as best as possible. It's not the perfect form to display a poem, but let's go ahead and read it and try to respect the white space as well as the punctuation, and I'll do the same. After suicide, a hole is nothing, but what remains around it? My brother stood in the refrigerator light, drinking milk that poured out of his head, through thick black curls, down his back into a puddle, growing larger around him. My body stood between the living room and kitchen, one foot on worn carpet, one on cold linoleum. He couldn't hear his name, clouding from my mouth, settling in the fluorescent air. I wanted to put my finger into the hole, feel the smooth channel he escaped through, stop the milk so he could swallow it, but my body held as if driven into place. Some interesting things going on here. Of course, we're both into the syllabic couplet that he's using as a structuring element. We see light as sort of some of the recurring language that he's going to use. We already discovered that in the prior poem and throughout the collection. Some of the sounds that are interesting, very evocative going on here. Lights and milk, thick, black, and back. So we have assonance, body, stood, room, one foot on, worn, one on cold, clouding from mouth. A lot of vowels going on here and O sounds, right? This assonance that he's infusing. And it's because of the sonic engagement that allows us to sort of pulls us into the poetry. The binary opposition that we mentioned before is echoed to the narrator slash speaker standing and straddling between the worn carpet and the cold linoleum floor. So what does that mean? He's both within the realm of this world and some other. He's straddling between these two worlds. Also, whole. What is a whole? But the absence of something, correct? A whole is defined by that which is around it, the structure of it, around it, not within it. Metaphor and simile, I wanted to put my finger into the hole, feel the smooth channel he escaped through. The poem's ending is always interesting as well. I would implore you to look at each of Rasmussen's endings, how he ends a poem. The end effect is what we call it within poetry. And within this one, he says to stop the milk so he could swallow it. But my body held as if driven into place. What does that mean? My body held as if driven into place. Maybe the shock of the image of being driven into the place by these horrific images, this incident of his brother, mourning his brother, the aftermath that it left and the shock that it left on both he and his family. Okay, same title, After Suicide, another poem with the same title within the collection that has a lot of meaning infused within it, specifically metaphor and how a lot of symbolism that's taking place. Let's go ahead and read it. After Suicide. In the hallway of life, you are a rose with no stem, and I, the janitor, sweeping away the fallen petals. You said the world revolves, while we ourselves remain in the darkness of the never ending, never beginning, never. I say that the man who was humiliated in the second act and shot himself in the fifth, stands up, smiles, bows. The lamp asks, is it the shadow writing this? The pen? Or they're converging? The paper asks nothing. Okay, so some interesting metaphors and even symbols taking place within the beginning of this poem. We get his brother as a rose, right? What's a rose symbolic of? life, growing, growth, love, flowers in general, um, summer. Uh, the metaphor of his brother being a stemless rose is even further complicates the image and what it's symbolic of. What is a stemless rose? There's no grounding in this world, perhaps, no footing, no substructure that a stem would be to a rose or any flower. And then we have the fallen petals, would be symbolic of the aftermath left behind after his brother's death, right? And he is the janitor. The narrator is the janitor, the one whose duty it is to clean it all up, to make it the mess pristine, or at least normal again, to normalize something, right? To clean up this mess that his brother has created, that is impacted both he and his family. The shadow in here is a great opposition. The darkness we get um, is a great sort of oppositional language, similar to darkness, working against the efforts of light. And as we said before, light is synonymous. He's using light as this synonymous language against the word life, right? And then it's something interesting feature of this poem is at the end we sort of get the anthropomorphizing of the lamp and the paper. Just an interesting feature that he infused within it. And other poems that ever point out as well, he does the same thing. Of the three poems after suicide, I think this one is the most evocative. I think it does the most poetically. Let's go ahead and read it, then we'll discuss it. After suicide. At the party celebrating me, you always show up late and dead. Ding dong, ding dong. No one gets the door. We know better. You let yourself in, sidle up to people who never knew you, and tell them jokes. I have such terrible aim. I had to shoot myself twice. Three suicidal Norwegians walk into a bar. The first one complains of a splitting headache and orders a beer. Unable to ignite even a sizzle of laughter, you put a flashlight into your mouth and turn it on. On the wall behind you, a coin of light hovers like the miniature sun a magnifying glass makes. Your head's projector. Your head's a projector showing the movie of your death. We sip our drinks with unease as, luckily, the wall begins to smoke and everyone runs out into the cool lawns to watch the house burn. Relieved you're still inside. Very interesting and evocative things going on here. Number one, the tension that exists between this individual, almost zombie-like, showing up. The story of this, right? It's almost zombie-like individual, his brother showing up at this party. How bizarre and surreal and macabre all at the same time. So there's great conflict and tension that exists of what's taking place, the actual story of this poem. Brother shows up at this dinner party or cocktail party, whatever it is, some sort of gathering, to celebrate the narrator for whatever reason. We don't have to know the whole story, but we get the images that are being thrown at us in the circumstances of this party and this weirdness, this strangeness and surrealness of him showing up, his brother, after death, showing up after his suicide, the title of it, right? Reflecting back to that. And then we get the end effect again, to the last couplet, to watch the house burn, or let's do the last two couplets, to smoke and everyone runs out onto the cool lawns to watch the house burn, relieved you're still inside. So the end effect, begging the question as to why they're relieved. Why are they relieved? It could be we want this zombie-like thing to go back to wherever it came, to be dead, to let the dead be dead. Either let the dead come alive as they were, as they actually were when they lived, which doesn't happen. Because when you come back, psycho zombie, you're never the same, as we know, as our culture is sort of so fanatical about the idea of zombieism, right? Or go back to being dead. We're relieved that the house is going to burn and you with it. Some of the we talked. Remember about the elements of poetry. We talked about twerking verbs. And I think he does a great job within here. We get sound within this is sound effects within like ding dong, right, of the doorbell. Um, but we also get words like ignite, which I think is a great twerking of the verb, and then that goes along with flashlight. And we get this sort of he teases the idea to us right away that there's going to be a fire towards the end of the poem with the word ignite. The ding dong, I just thought about this. It reminds me of a short story uh, called The Monkey's Paw. And within it, uh, they have a child, a couple has a child that dies, and they want to bring it to life, back to life so much that they go to a talisman, and he gives them this monkey's paw. And they say, within a certain amount of time, your son's going to come back alive, right? And so one night at the end of the time period when they were told that their son would come back alive, They hear a knocking at the door. It's nighttime, right? And the short story ends with them either wanting to open the door but being hesitant towards it, and we don't know. It's a cliffhanger. We never get to see if the parents open the door and what the son's going to be like after being dead for so long, right? So in this sort of same situation, you get the ding dong of the doorbell, but no one gets the door. We know better. They're hesitant perhaps. Uh, so imagery, some interesting imagery going on here. A coin of light hovers like the miniature sun a magnifying glass makes. So we can see that. It's beautiful as well. A beautiful rendering of that moment. Your head's a projector showing the movie of your death. Um, Putting the flashlight in the hole, right, of his head is beautiful. Great way. We can see it. It brings it to life, right? It's concrete. These images are concrete. We can see them. There's not much work we have to do in terms of interpretation that abstract language would require. The tension that exists within this, the imagery, the language, it all is working with great effect. Okay, any questions? As always, email me if you have any comments, concerns, or questions concerning the material, or anything in general. I know these are trying times, so please reach out to me. So the rest of the week, we're going to read Black Aperture in order to consider which direction you want your short essay to take. And the short essay is not due till next week. I want to give you, an ample amount of time in order to craft that and revise it and polish it. Um, Uh, Contact me if any questions with regard to the thesis statement, what you want your actual essay to be about, and I'll help you sort of formulate that. But I think, and I believe if you go into the comment within the discussion I created in Blackboard, there's no time limit. You'll be able to see other people's comments within the discussion and realize what direction maybe you want to take within the short essay that's due next week. Consider the poems that we spoke about today, the three after suicides, and then I mentioned that I'm going to talk about tomorrow. Monet is a verb, trajectory, Chekhov's gun, and a number of other ones, but specifically those, sort of to discover their literary connections to the past. And what service they're doing within the actual collection of poetry. So please comment. As I said before, there's no time limit to comment within the discussion on Blackboard, and I'll make that available today at some point. Thank you. Talk to you guys later. Bye.